Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between. My name is Jacques Lamar from the Mark Twain House Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program on behalf of the museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. Tonight, we are welcoming Dahlma Llanos-Figueroa and Luis Figueroa-Martínez for a discussion of Dahlma's novel, A Woman of Endurance. We're very excited to have you all here tonight as we discuss this, and we're going to get to the book very quickly. However, I do have a few bits of housekeeping to do. First, tonight is our first night doing these events on Zoom, so hopefully we will not have any technical hiccups of any sort, but in the event that we do, please be patient with us as we're working things out. This is our first time off Crowdcast, and we're excited for these new frontiers. The virtual programs for the Mark Twain House Museum are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. And we're happy to honor his memory with these programs, which he would have loved so much. We're also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and CT Public WNPR for supporting tonight's program and all our other virtual programs. One of the benefits of having a virtual program is that you, as the audience, can have your own conversation in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to have conversations down there. Just click on the little chat bubble. The chat bar should show up for you. We're also going to be posting a link for you to purchase a signed copy of A Woman of Endurance, which, of course, your purchase will benefit the Mark Twain House and Museum. If you have a specific question for Dahlma and Luis, you can go ahead and post that directly in the Q&A section for the end of the program, again at the bottom of your screen. Please also note that you can click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event, which is something that we've not been able to offer before. So we're really grateful for that. Now, I'd like to formally introduce our two guests. First, our author, Dahlma Llanos-Figueroa, was born in Puerto Rico and raised in New York City. She is a product of the Puerto Rican communities on the island and in the South Bronx. She attended the New York City public school system and received her academic degrees from SUNY at Buffalo and CUNY Queens College. As a child, she was sent to live with her grandparents in Puerto Rico, where she was introduced to the culture of rural Puerto Rico, including the storytelling that came naturally to the women in her family, especially the older women. Much of her work is based on her experiences during this time. The hardcover edition of Daughters of Stone was shortlisted as a 2010 finalist for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. In 2020, the self-published paperback edition won the 16th Annual National Indie Excellence Awards for Multicultural Fiction. Dahlma was one of the awardees of the 2021 NYSCA NYFA Artist Fellow in Fiction and the 2021 City Artist Corps Grant Awards, and her distinctions go on, but I want to get to the talk as quickly as possible. So I'm going to just jump down and let you know that the English and Spanish language editions of Dahlma's second novel, A Woman of Endurance, were released in April of this year. Our moderator tonight is Luis Figueroa-Martínez. He's an associate professor at Trinity College here in Hartford in their history department, where he has been teaching Caribbean, Latin American, and U.S. Latino history since 1996. He is the author of Sugar, Slavery, and Freedom in 19th-Century Puerto Rico, University of North Carolina Press, which won a nonfiction book award from the Puerto Rico chapter of PEN International, the island's equivalent of the UK's English PEN Hessel Tiltman Prize for historical nonfiction works. His documentary filmmaking works include serving as a historic consultant and or co-producer on two CPTV films on Puerto Ricans, Puerto Rican Passages on Migration to Connecticut, and Ritmo de Pueblo, Rhythm of the People, on music, culture, colonialism, and national ethnic racial identities. Historian and producer, Rockefeller and Kellogg Foundations funded doc, film, race, poverty, and politics in Hartford during the late 1960s of urban uprisings. He's also produced, directed, and edited 2 direct cinema documentary films on racism, homophobia, and sexism at Trinity College, Beyond the Surface. So please, let's welcome to the screen our guests, Dahlma and Luis, and please sit back and enjoy. Don't forget, there will be a Q&A at the end of the program, so be sure to post your questions. And Luis, call me back in about 40 minutes and I will help with the Q&A.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you.
So just make sure all the technology is in place here. Dahlma, welcome again. We spoke a little bit in the afternoon. Welcome to, even though this is a virtual encounter, I still want to welcome you to Hartford, to the community of people in Hartford that have made the Mark Twain House for decades a cultural center with a very historical nature. The connections to Hartford history, literature, culture, and so forth. Welcome also in the virtual space of connection between Puerto Ricans from the diaspora here in the United States, those who were born and raised here, those who were born here, raised there, or raised there, and so forth, because as Dahlma and others here might know, we are one people with this or these particularities, right? And this will reflect, perhaps, hopefully, in some ways, in our understanding today in our conversation. For those of you who are not familiar with that, we'll explore it in a little bit. Dahlma, I want to start first by, so that the audience that does not know you or your work can understand a little bit how scholars appreciate it, okay? I don't want to go to too many quotes of works and so forth, but I've noticed, looking at the people, obviously, because your new book is so recent, most of the scholarship is on your earlier work, especially and so I've noticed that you are referenced by some authors, by some scholars, as one example of many of Afro-Latina women in the Caribbean diaspora, right? Women from the Caribbean in the United States, whether they were born in the United States or in the Caribbean, that's a particular diaspora, right? I mentioned earlier the Puerto Rican diaspora, but your work has been commented upon in the broader context of Caribbean literature, and particularly Caribbean women's literature, regardless of the cultural, linguistic region of the Caribbean or of the diaspora here in the United States. You have been discussed as an example of authors who want to rescue the historical memory of people from the Caribbean or the Caribbean diasporas here in the United States. A task that you and others have taken upon themselves. I admire you, because that's a huge undertaking. In our case, for those of you in the audience who are not aware of this, we need to establish, as the conversation goes on and later in the Q&A, that there are some important differences between the story of the African diaspora, enslavement, issues of gender, sexuality, historical memory. There are very important similarities, of course, but also important differences between the cultural, historical traditions in the United States, properly speaking, and the Caribbean and Latin America. So we will try to pay attention to that as we go along. But back to the issue of your task. You've written, among other things, an essay on why I write. That's correct? So now that for the purpose of the audience to understand how you are located by scholars as an Afro-Hispanic woman writer taking on the task of recovering historical memories through historical fiction, can you tell people here, maybe work with that article or maybe more recent thoughts. What brought you to writing?
Okay, first of all, thank you for that welcome. Thank you for the Mark Twain House, Jacques and yourself, for introducing me to the Hartford audience. The little interaction that I've had with the Hartford community, I've been welcomed warmly, and I so appreciate that. Now, as to a little bit about me, I was born in Puerto Rico. I was brought to New York City by my parents when I was 2 years old. And we lived in several places. We lived in El Barrio, and we moved up to the Bronx because back then that was considered moving on up. But as the city changed and as communities became more problematic, I was sent to live in Puerto Rico with my grandparents while my parents saved to buy a house. And it is there that I fell in love with story and storytelling. When I came back to, and in Puerto Rico, I lived in rural Carolina in an almost entirely Afro-descendant community, and almost everyone there was my relative. We have, I think of them as clans as opposed to families. So who knows how far the Figueroas go and whether we are even related distantly because of that. But at any rate, when I came back to the United States, I hungered for story. And one of the things that I found was that the stories that I was given to read in school, the stories that I saw in film and on television, didn't include anybody who looked like me, who sounded like me, who had a family structure and my culture. And I was a good student. I did well in public school. I went to college and majored in English and Spanish literature. And even then, I could not find myself neither in the literature of the United States or the literature of Puerto Rico or Latin America. And so, and that's not to say that there weren't examples of negritude in those areas, but I wasn't exposed to it. And I didn't read my first Afro-Puerto Rican writer until I read P.D. Thomas in college. And even though I loved his work, that wasn't my reality either. He had a very streetwise 1950s El Barrio lifestyle that was nothing like the lifestyle in my home, where if we got out of school at 3:15, we better be home. Mm-hmm. So I longed for finding myself in American letters. It didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And then much later, when I read Toni Morrison, it made absolute sense to me when she said, if there's a book that you want to read and it hasn't been written, then you must write it. And that's what I have chosen to do. I got tired of the erasure and the silence of our images in the media, and even more offended by the stereotype of Puerto Ricans in particular, but Latinos in general. It's as though nobody wanted to look at individual people. They just blanketed everyone with a very negative stereotype. And so it is my job to give a face and a voice to Puerto Rican characters in American literature.
Fantastic. And I want the audience to understand that, and emphasis, I really hang on to her comment that she wanted to find herself, a position for herself in American letters. Beautiful construction. Because we as Puerto Ricans, Latinos in general, but let's talk here in particular about Puerto Ricans and then Afro-Puerto Ricans, is that we seem to be, like you said, invisible. erased within the context of American culture, except in particular context that we could explore later. So I appreciate that. Now, going back to your journey, having been born in Puerto Rico, moved to New York City when you were 2 years old, living in El Barrio in East Harlem, in Upper Manhattan, the Bronx. Very common journey for people of our generation, especially because
Absolutely.
since then it has changed. But back in the even going back further before our generation, back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, most Puerto Ricans who migrated to the United States migrated to New York City.
Yes.
And a lot of them moved within the city to East Harlem, El Barrio, South Bronx, Brooklyn also. But I'm curious because I think that those of you in the audience who have read her novel, that's where I'm headed here, will appreciate this. And those who are curious, I want to really convince you that this is a magnificent piece of work that you should read.
Thank you.
But we need to make connections to specific places. Mm-hmm. So you said that you were sent when you were a child. I can't remember exact age, but you were sent back to live with your grandparents in Puerto Rico, in Carolina. Now, Carolina, for those of you who are not familiar with this, Carolina is one of the small counties in Puerto Rico that was very rural, very intense in the experience of slavery and sugarcane plantations from the late 1700s through the 1800s, when slavery finally ended in Puerto Rico in the 1870s. But that as Puerto Rico modernized after World War II, being so close to San Juan, eventually it grew or was redeveloped into a suburb of San Juan. Many places, not all of it, and that's part of the exploration here. But the northern part of the county was developed into suburbs, tourist areas, hotels, and so forth. But what you are referencing, where you went to live with your grandparents, is the southern part of the county, the rural barrios, right? The rural areas
Exactly.
of Carolina. And I would like if you could describe that place a little bit. You already mentioned, that it was heavily Afro-Puerto Rican, almost exclusively. You mentioned that people were think about more in terms of clans, or we can call them extended families.
Absolutely.
Right? And if you could go by, you said that you learned about storytelling. And I'm very, very interested in following this before we go in a moment, very quick moment, into the novel, because the novel is about traditions of storytelling. It's not just the content, the structure, the descriptions, the metaphors, the characters, made me connect to traditions of storytelling among earlier generations of Puerto Ricans.
Yes.
Your grandparents, I'm sure, uncles, aunts, or granduncles, grand-aunts, madrinas, godmothers, padrinos,
Everybody,
godfathers,
yes.
right? And all the people, born probably in the late 19th century, some of them even,
Yes.
right? So they had a connection to Puerto Rico, to a direct connection, more closer relation to the era, just after the era of the period that you cover principally in the book. Yes. So I have quick image that I want to share with the audience. So that, because I'm a historian, I have to say I'm not a literary critic, and I always like to locate people in places. So here's a map of the counties, and Puerto Rico, these counties are very small. People call them towns, but town is really the urban part of the county. The pueblo, as you can see here in the map, this area is the pueblo. That's where the original town was. So as I was saying earlier, the northern parts were the areas that were developed for suburban subdivisions, commercial, the airport, tourism hotels, beaches. And as time progressed after World War II, more and more of these barrios, rural areas, rural wards were developed. So could you let us know, broadly speaking, you don't have to mention if you don't want to, the specific barrio, but at least give us a sense of what part of the county you were at, because I suspect it was in the southern part. Was it?
I was in San Antonio.
Uh-huh.
And yes, the urbanization came very close, but there was still a separation between the countryside. And at that time, which was in the late 1950s, early 1960s, there were still rural areas in San Antonio that were made up not of large plantations anymore, but small farms. My grandfather and his 10 siblings were farmers. My grandfather grew sugarcane, and he had a small herd of cattle and had small agricultural products. And they had a very strong feeling that you never sell the land, that as long as you have the land, you can survive. And at a time when many other Puerto Ricans were having difficulties securing enough food for survival, families who had these small farms were able to live a relatively comfortable life, send their kids to school, and progress. And so I came into the picture at that time. Coming from New York City, I was used to getting the milk from the supermarket, and now there was this cow that had to be milked. And so it was an eye-opener for me. And it was wonderful because it allowed me to experience a lifestyle that is quickly disappearing, and that we need to safeguard this patrimony before it's all gone. So now in San Antonio, you may still have the same families that have been there for 100 years, but that's tempered with cell phones and computers and IT and everything else that are symbols of contemporary 21st century modernity.
Yes. In the novel, Carolina, set in Carolina a little bit, but there are scenes, episodes that happen in towns in the vicinity of Carolina. The novel starts, without giving away for those who haven't read it, I don't want to give spoilers, but at least set a context, right? Starts with the principal character, Pola, trying to escape through an area of a county next to Carolina called Loíza, which for Puerto Ricans from the island and the diaspora familiar with this, Loíza has a very particular importance in Puerto Rican, particularly Afro-Puerto Rican identity, as a place where there is a concentration of African heritage that has been sustained over centuries.
Absolutely.
And contradictory, not because it was a sugar plantation area as much, but for other reasons that are tied to your novel that I want us to explore. So when you were growing up, you traveled through Loíza and that area. How did people see your family, others? What kind of memory you have of Loíza when you were living there growing up?
Loíza is very much in my heart. It's my second home on the island. It is a very rich Afro-descendant culture in terms of food, in terms of religion, in terms of all manner of culture. For us, it was a day trip to pile into the car and go to Piñones or Loíza to the beach, because we didn't have a beach, we were landlocked. So for us, that was an incredibly freeing journey to get to the shoreline and to explore the beauty of una palmera, a whole coastline of palm trees and undeveloped seashore. So
Yes.
for me, it's a very important place. Historically, of course, there was a large freed community. And I think that has something to do with why they were able to maintain a lot of their culture. But con todo respeto, you're a historian and I respect your field, but I have no problems bending history a little to suit my narrative.
Of course.
So that, for instance,
that's one of the things that I love.
There's no way that Pola could have run overnight from Carolina to Loíza, but I needed that distance shortened, which is why I love fiction, because you have the ability to do that. So in a sense, she was running from the plantation to the heart of home, in a sense.
Yes. Yes, she was trying to escape slavery, but also she seems to want to return to Africa, not just to escape slavery and be like a runaway maroon, as they were called, enslaved person that ran away and obtained some kind of freedom by escaping within the island, even if it's nearby. But she also seems to want to return to Africa.
She wants a release. She wants a release from this horrible life that she has been burdened with.
And I want, for the audience that might not be familiar with the places that we're talking about, because now we're going to get deeper, and this is very essential. I'm going to share now, this is from Google Earth, right? So that people get a sense what it looks like, because even the way it looks like now retains a great deal, this particular area of Puerto Rico retains a great deal of linkage with the past, even 200, 150 years ago. So I'm going to use my hand here in the screen. I hope people can see that. That's Carolina. The county runs this area. You can see all the subdivisions. Here is the airport. But I wanted to notice that the township of Loíza is in this area, but there is a whole area that is not developed, right? And this area is called the forest of Vacía Talega. It's an enormous forest of palm trees, of coconut trees, where runaway enslaved people who left the plantations in places like Carolina, and further east of Loíza. I'm going to move the map here for people. I hope that they don't get too confused here. I'm moving it so that you understand. To the east of Puerto Rico, this is the northeastern corner of Puerto Rico, right? Fajardo was a major center of African slavery and sugar plantations, major port of importation directly from Africa of enslaved Africans. If we move further, going south to further in the east, all this area, Naguabo is one of those counties in Puerto Rico that a lot of people don't know is very Afro-Puerto Rican in its people and its traditions. If we continue, then we can see other parts of the island that we're going to look at later. But let's return to Carolina. Let's return to Loíza. Zooming out here, I want people to notice that a lot of this region is still to this day undeveloped. And the people in these communities here have fought against tourism development for decades. But the good thing about this, I'll confess to you, Dahlma, I'm sure a lot of people familiar with Puerto Rico, even if they're not Puerto Rican, familiar with this area, know how dense is this area here with the Vaciatalega forest, with the coconut palm trees, and the communities. Piñones is a very well-known community, but there are also people who live within, and they've been living there for centuries. Illegally in many cases, because these were lands that no one could plant sugar. They're not good for that. They're forested areas where they found refuge, right? So let's get back to the novel. Paula and I, by the way, I'm a historian who loves writers and filmmakers. So you don't need to apologize about inventing things or condensing or whatever. I totally enjoy this. She runs through that. That's what I wanted. I hope people understand what I'm doing that, but I'm sure that Dahlma understands what I wanted to show you, the Google Earth, because otherwise we don't think of this place today as it was in the time covering the novel, when Paula was running to escape this. And there's a lot of it, even today, that seems to be there from the 1830s and 1840s.
Absolutely.
So was visiting these places, was living in Carolina, when you first thought growing up that you wanted to reclaim those memories, those stories passed on from generations, or is this something that came later?
I was sent to Puerto Rico when I was 9. So I was really too young to formulate that level of sophisticated thought. But I did know that there was something very special about this place. And I do believe that I spent years absorbing the environment almost by osmosis. Sitting on the beach for 4 hours and watching the animals that were coming by, and the people who were riding by on horses, and ladies who were picking up palm fronds and wood from the beach to cook on their fogones, you know. All those memories became ingrained in my subconscious. And I think they slept there until I was ready to give them a language. So until I graduated from college and started working with our community that was still coming and were still immigrants, and I was trying to find material to give to my students that they could find themselves in a respectful and authentic way. And I kept not finding anything I could give them. And I think at that point, I started realizing that I would have to start processing my impressions into written language. And I needed that time to study other authors, to study the literature of the world, to see how I could refine the storytelling that I got so naturally from my family, and how I could apply craft to the telling of what was always an oral tradition, an oral history. And I felt it was my mission to take those stories that my ancestors shared in private and give them a public exposure, for want of a better word.
In what is not only an artistic, an educational project, it's also a political project.
Absolutely.
It's also a political project, not only in terms of the visibility of Puerto Ricans and our African and Afro-Puerto Rican traditions, with the general public in this country, but also within our community.
Absolutely.
Among Puerto Ricans, one of the topics that comes through in the novel are the distinctions during the slavery times. This is the peak of the slavery period in Puerto Rico, is the first about 70 years of the 19th century, okay? For those of you who do not know, Puerto Rico blossomed as a sugar plantation society late, Cuba as well. It was not until the late 1700s that really the economy of sugar plantations with enslaved labor imported from Africa and other parts of the Caribbean really blossomed. Between the late 1700s and the 1850s, around 125,000 Africans were imported to Puerto Rico. Now, for the audience to appreciate we're talking about proportions. When the 18th century began, the 19th century began in 1800, the population of the island of Puerto Rico there's no precise census, but it's estimated to have been around 100,000 people. By 1900, now we have a full census done by the American colonial regime. The Puerto Rican population had grown to about 500,000 people, and then kept growing from there. So given these numbers, to import to the island between roughly the 1760s, 1770s, and the 1850s, for a little less than a century, about 125,000 Africans is an enormous quantity for the small size
For
of
the
the
tiny
island,
size of the island, yes.
and the tiny size of and also the geography of the island, because it's an island that has so many hills and mountains that, unlike Cuba, or let's say another example, unlike Barbados, which are mostly, in the case of Cuba, all, like I would say, like 80% of Cuba is lower, flat lands, rolling lands. Developing sugar plantations is easier in those areas. For proportion's sake, people, so that you understand how important is this work that she's doing artistically, educationally, and politically. Cuba is several times bigger than Puerto Rico, but a dozen or more times bigger than Puerto Rico. Cuba imported the Spaniards brought into Cuba, and the Cubans, and white Cubans, brought about 750,000 Africans during the same period that they imported about 120,000 Africans to Puerto Rico. And yet Cuba is several times bigger. The reason I bring Cuba is for readers who have read the book and noticed that the identity of Pola and other people is traced to a particular region of Africa, to a particular ethnic group in West Africa called the Yoruba people and the Yoruba land. I'll show you later if we need a map of what this looks like, but roughly we're talking about an area from southwestern Nigeria, the country of Benin, and the country of Togo. Among the many ethnic groups of Africans that existed at that time and still today, this particular group became very important in the history of enslavement of Africans in Cuba, in other parts of the Caribbean, but especially by far in Cuba and Brazil. Ironically, the Yoruba people had been engaged in the slave trade, enslaving fellow Africans. And then towards I would say that the seventh inning of the game, so to speak, they became more of the people that were captured and enslaved in West Africa, which is the period that you're covering. The period that you're covering in the novel is when the great number of Yoruba people were enslaved by other ethnicities. I mean, they went from people who were victims as well as victimizers in the 15, 16, 1700s, to a situation in which the breakdown of the empire in the late 1700s brought enormous quantities of Yoruba people to the Caribbean, to Louisiana, and to Brazil and other places from the late 1700s through the period of your novel of the first half of the 19th century. I'd like to hear your response to this, because I found it quite particularly important that you assign a connection to a specific ethnicity in Africa.
Well, in this novel, in A Woman of Endurance, the focus is on the African community. In fact, the white characters are peripheral to the Black community. They're very important because they had economic and physical power over them. However, my focus was on how does this community, the Black community, which has been enslaved and has been captured and removed from all those things that stabilize a community, how did they interact with each other? My main character, my protagonist, Pola, is a Yoruba woman who arrives with her Yoruba beliefs. And she finds in this particular place that there are Africans from all over the continent. I wanted to show a nuanced and complex community because I'm tired of people representing African communities in slave narratives as these kind of additives that were pretty much all the same. And they made them all the same by virtue of not giving them human characteristics, really. So I wanted to make sure that my Black characters embodied the diversity of that community, both, as you say, physically, educationally. I have Black characters who are scholars, Black characters who are collaborators, Black characters who have self-loathing and allow themselves to become weapons of the white power structure. I also have a Black albino who feels that she's better than the whites. She's whiter than white. I wanted to show this community as having all the facets and all of the intricacies of any other community. And Yoruba has a lot to do with my characters. Both my first book, Daughters of the Stone, and this book have Yoruba deities as characters within the story. And in this case, Yemaya, who is the goddess of the ocean. And so from the very beginning, Pola has this connection, lack of connection with this deity that she perceives of, you've brought me here, why? Why do I need to stay here with these savage people? And so the Yoruba culture has a great deal to do with my characters.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, because before because we're getting close to when Jack will interrupt us to manage the conversation. One last thing, Jack, 1 second, is that is a particular goddess within the Yoruba religious spiritual tradition is absolutely core in this novel and other work that you have done. Yemaya, the goddess of the sea, of water, of fertility. The middle passage, fertility, the middle passage as a woman. And this is something that I want to have a conversation, or those of you in the audience that read the novel, but I will try to bring it up again, because that spiritual part is important. That's what allows Paula and other characters to survive. So let's go to the Q&A with Jack moderating.
All right, so I actually would, because I think we kind of didn't really tell what the story of the book is yet. And so I think there's going to be a swath of people who are watching who have not read the novel yet. And we're, of course, hoping that you will be sufficiently intrigued by this conversation to do so. So Dahlma, could you give us a kind of a cliff notes of the book without spoiling?
Right. Well, this novel is the story of Pola, who is an African woman, an African Yoruba woman who is captured and brought to Puerto Rico and sold as a breeder. Her children, she was repeatedly assaulted. Her children are taken away as soon as they're born and they're sold, and she never sees them again. And what I wanted to do was examine the neo-slave narrative from a woman's point of view. And I wanted to explore the issue, all enslaved people were treated brutally and violently, but I wanted to examine how gender in particular affected the experience of this one character. And you cannot tell a neo-slave narrative without brutality and violence. But what I want my readers to know is that they should trust me that I won't leave you there. Obviously, we had to go beyond that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here and many of us wouldn't be here, right? Our ancestors managed to take strength from what they brought with them and support each other so that they could move forward. So for Paula, she starts off in a horrible situation, but this novel is a journey to healing and a journey to find endurance and survival.
And does the novel start in Africa with her capture, or do we start the story with her already in Puerto Rico?
Technically, we start the story in Puerto Rico, but there are flashbacks to let you know what happened in Africa, what happened that led her to this place. And this is, I have to remind you, this is the second novel in a series. Now you don't need to have read the first novel, Daughters of the Stone. Pola first appears in Daughters of the Stone, and she has a minor part. And then she kept nagging me, this character kept nagging me about wanting her own story. And I thought I was going to tell one story, but I meditate, and in my meditation, she said, no, that's not the story. This is the story. And so I, again, transferred those images from my meditation into language and tried to put the reader in the place of this person, because I think of her as a person. So it's not just dates and figures, but trying to seduce the reader into having the experience of going through that and surviving it.
Now, when you wrote Daughters of the Stone, did you sense that it was the first in what you are now saying is 5 stories? Is that
No,
correct?
I thought it was going to be one book and that's it. But readers kept saying, well, what happened to this one? And what happened to the other one? When I handed in the original Daughters of the Stone, it was over 500 pages. And my then publisher said, no way, 300 is the limit. You're gonna have to cut half the book out. And so, of course, the readers wanted to know more when it came out. And so this was my way of giving them more. I don't know whether it'll be 4 or 5 books. We will see. But what I'm trying to do is do one book for each generation. And there are 5 generations. And this is how Pola came to be.
Got
The
it.
third book, which is already on its way, will go from emancipation into the 20th century.
So-
Jack, can I interrupt one
Sure.
thing quickly, because it's
Sure.
just connected to that? Could you talk, Dahlma, about the aspect of love? Because it's not just a film about the exploitation of women, enslaved women's bodies, but it's also a story about love in all manifestations of love.
Yes.
There are different characters,
Yes.
Chachita and Simon and others. So the issue of love, if you could rescue that for a moment and then we can move on.
Sure. There are within this community, like every other complex community, there are many faces of love. So there are the mother-daughter, the husband and wife, the women who were taken out of Africa, for the most part, lost their mothers. So how do you find a mother? How do you define motherhood? And who provides that kind of protection and love? So her journey is learning how to trust, learning how to love, learning how to heal. And all of that is developed throughout the story.
I want to thank Rebecca, who's put a few questions in here, and invite other people who are watching to add their questions.
Good.
First is, I'm going to actually start with her last question, which was, you said that the character of Pola in Daughters of the Stone kept speaking to you. What was it about Pola that kept calling you back to her story?
Well, in the first book, Pola was a very combative, angry, impatient woman who obviously had a lot of rage. I thought that if I wrote a book about her, she would be like a slave revolt leader, because she had that kind of a strong character. But actually, she had another story to be told. And so now I had to find a way to make her compelling to the reader. So that's how she came about. It was adding another face to the faces of the characters in the first novel. And so
do you, obviously giving her a novel length story deepens her as a character.
Absolutely.
Were there surprises for you in the process of creating Paula for this book that you did not anticipate?
Absolutely. I do not, even though I was an English teacher for 30 years and I taught outlining, and every time you read, you should sit down to write an outline. And when I started writing creatively and professionally, that all went out the window. I don't know how things will end. I learn about my characters as I go along. I often am wrong, and they set me straight. But I love discovering them and presenting them to the reader. So I love talking to readers. When I write, it's a dialogue, a monologue. But when I present it to readers and talk to them, it becomes a dialogue. And that's how I grow as a writer.
So another question that Rebecca asks, and I think it really goes back to Daughters of the Stone, is, can you tell us more about the inspiration for your story? But I think we have to go back to the first novel to ask about how you got inspired, I think, to write this, what appears to be an epic in the making.
Yes, it seems to keep growing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think that because, as I said, there was such an absence of our presence in American letters that I really felt that this was a huge vacuum that needed to be filled. And it needed to be filled by all those people and all those personages that I heard about as a kid that fascinated me, that weren't written down anywhere. And I wanted them to have life and breathe air.
And when you say that in terms of underrepresentation, are you referring specifically to Afro-Latino voices or Puerto Rican voices, or?
I think in general, Puerto Rican voices have not been magnified to the general community. Otherwise, you wouldn't have all the misunderstandings and all the really horrible situations that happened after Maria, where you have all these Puerto Rican American citizens that got basically no relief because people didn't know we were citizens, didn't realize that was part of the United States in a sense. So there was so much lack of information that I really felt that it had to be explored. And because the Afro-Boricua narrative is my story, that's what I focus on, what I know best. I can't write about the elite in Condado because that's not what I know, right? That's what I would have to research. I needed to write what I know before it's gone.
Now you said the book was translated into Spanish. Did you not do that translation yourself?
No, I didn't. This is the book in, dear.
It's disappearing. There we go.
It's disappearing. Indómita. No, Aurora Lausardo translated it. She did an excellent job. And we sat down with my Spanish language editor, Edward Benitez, and we went through the book, making sure that it was the language of Puerto Rico, the different languages, because you have uneducated country people, you have the owners of the plantation, you have Simon, who is a Muslim scholar, and his voice is all about praise be to Allah. So you had to have facility with all these voices. And I think she did an excellent job, as did the people who did the audiobooks, both in English and Spanish. And so I'm very proud of them.
So the next question I'm going to pose, it's again from Rebecca, but I'm going to pose it to both of you. She asking about what additional research did you use to create your story? But it's a lot of research that Luis also did for his book. I know that those are two completely separate books, and his is more from an academic standpoint. So I'm going to start with Luis real quick and talk about what interested you in pursuing telling the story of enslavement in Puerto Rico and the sugarcane plantations and whatnot, and then we're gonna bounce back to Dahlma and find out how she did, or what the work she did, which may have included your book. I don't know.
Excuse me. Well, I would say that my case was very similar. The origin of my project was my family and my extended family. They were I grew up with my mother side of the family. My grandfather's family were originally from the southeastern coast. There is a county called Salinas, and next to it Guayama, which is like the main town city in the southeast. Huge area of the third most important and densely African sugar and slavery experience in Puerto Rico in the 19th century. About a quarter of the population of Guayama and Salinas were Africans at various points in the first half of the 19th century. And so I heard a lot of stories. I visited family who live in Arroyo, Guayama, Salinas. I'm from Coamo, but I heard all these stories. But in school growing up, this was not studied. When I went to college, it was just the beginning of people publishing some good historical scholarship on slavery, but it left me wanting to tell the story of this part of the island. And I decided to focus on what is going to be your next volume, Dahlma, the transition from slavery to emancipation, right? What happened to the people after they were freed, both Africans and those born in Puerto Rico, as well those born in other parts of the Caribbean who were brought there. And I I envy your profession as a literary writer, because as a historian, I'm expected to only tell the truth, the fact, right? But I could not avoid mentioning my family and some of the stories, because just a couple of times, because that's my connection to the research. Now, what kinds of things did I do? All the documents that I was able to use that were produced in that region of southeastern Puerto Rico were in the National Archive in Puerto Rico. It's called Archivo General de Puerto Rico. There were hundreds of boxes. I saw probably like 800 or 900 boxes, archival boxes of documents. Notice the contrast to the United States. Completely not organized, not indexed, no catalog. You could open a box and it could be documents from the 1820s, or the next box could be documents from the 1780s. The next box is documents from the 1890s. No, I mean, it was a lot of work that should have been done by an archivist. I had to do it on top of actually reading the documents, but I read a lot of documents that, because there are few people who are Africans or African descent people from Puerto Rico and the Caribbean who are literate in a formal way, who could write, right? So how do you get to their stories? You get to them a lot of the time indirectly. And believe it or not, there are many sources. I'm just going to mention one here because I read a lot of these, were judicial court cases, both criminal and civil, documents from the police, from the paramilitary rural police, that is called Guardia Civil in Spain, documents collecting taxes, asking people to pay. I mean, so documents that were produced at a very local level, right, where you can find people speaking because they had to record the testimony in a court case. That's where I got a lot of the things.
So
Dahlma, I'm assuming you did not go through 800 or 900 disorganized or unorganized boxes.
I did not. I really wanted to focus on personalities and social systems as opposed to facts. Very quickly, when I started doing traditional research, I realized that facts don't always equal truth. Depends who's telling the story. I love the African proverb that says, you don't know what happened in the hunt until you talk to the lion. And the lion wasn't allowed to speak. And so I had to do the traditional research. I also met with archaeologists, architects, scholars at the university. I looked at newspapers of that time. And then my husband and I grabbed cameras and hit the street and tried to find the oldest people that we could. And frankly, those oral histories were much more important to my creation than a lot of the records that I found, which were written by owners and by military personnel and by other people who did not see the people that I was writing about as human beings. And therefore, they did not relate any of the human qualities that I was looking for. And so one of the things that I hope will happen is what I hope happens with all good literature, which is that we see the differences that location and time create, but we also see the commonalities and the human aspect of our collective experience.
Got it. All right, I have two more questions because we're running a little over time here.
A little.
And I'm going to combine. There's actually a sort of a a request in the chat for you to please consider rewriting this book for middle school students. She teaches in Hartford, and students need to hear from PR historic voices so they can understand their history. And I'm going to piggyback that on with Rebecca's question about, do any of your former students read your work? And what is that conversation like?
My former students have read the work, are reading the work, often show up at my readings unexpectedly, which is a joy for me. And all these years later, they're still hungering for that material that I couldn't find for them then, that I can now create for them. So I think that part of my public readings I love. In terms of writing for middle school, I was a middle school teacher for a while. And I don't think that I could write a novel for middle school kids, but I think that a lot of what I took out of the novel, what I edited out of the original novel, I'm working into short stories, and possibly they could be used in middle and school and early high school, rather than the novels that go into more detail that are really more adult oriented.
Got it.
Jack,
Yes.
do I have like 1 second for one last thing?
1 second.
Yes. I just want to share this screen here just because I can't help it. To why Simone is not only about women, this novel. So I produced this document over the weekend where I have the table of contents and I colored a certain structure, right? Where I can see chapters that have a lot of centrality of women, or Yemayah, which is a woman goddess. But there are all these chapters that are about Simone. Simone is such an important character here. Could you say something about Simone before we leave?
Okay, I'll do it very quickly. Simone is another character who showed up in my meditation. I did not plan for him to be in this story. He showed up and said, not only am I going to be in your book, but I'm going to speak directly to the reader. You will stay out of the way. And Simone, if you look at his chapters, there are only 6 of them, and they're very short. But I wanted to write about how this man falls in love with this woman. And so the first 2 chapters are he's looking at her, and then he's thinking about her, and then he's talking to her, and then she really becomes part of his core. So I love Simone, and I must say that a lot of my female readers have asked me if he has a younger brother, but we'll see. He will be in the next book as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad that we covered that little, because to me, that was very important.
I see that.
Sorry.
The last thing that I was going to ask, but I don't think we're going to have time because I think you could probably do this for hours, is Ann Pekovich asked for you to tell a few stories that were told to you by your grandparents. So I think Ann is going to have to catch you on the streets of the Bronx at some point for that.
Yeah, that's a long one.
That's a long one. First, I would like to thank Luis for his hard work preparing for tonight's talk, and obvious pleasure in this discussion. Second, I want to thank Dahlma for sharing her novel with us, and her wisdom. And I myself can't wait to. I bought this home, and my neighbor stole it. And she came back, she sent me a text about how much she loved it. So Dahlma has signed copies of the book for the Mark Twain House Museum. And I see that Aaron has graciously put into the chat the link that will allow you to buy a signed copy of the book. And of course, that benefits the museum. Final thank you is to, and I forgot to mention them in our opening remarks, our partners on this program, the Amistad Center for Art and Culture. They were very excited to work with us on this program because they are a cultural hub for work of the African diaspora, which of course would include the Afro-Latino population. Wonderful. And so my big apologies to our friends at the Amistad Center. So thank you all for joining us this evening.
Jacques,
yes.
Can I just say, my website is my whole name, DahlmaLlanos-Figueroa.com. And if people would like to get my monthly newsletter so they know where I will be appearing, they can go there and add their name to the mailing list.
Okay, I
want you to sign my copy later. I'll run into you in New York.
You got it.
There you go. I just put the link to her website. If I spelled the name correctly, I hope I did, in the chat. Dahlma, you're a teacher. If you want to proof it in the chat, let me grade my spelling. But again, a huge thank you to you both and to our viewing audience tonight. Hope you all enjoyed the program.
Thank you so much.
Have a good evening.
Que Dios te
Good
bendiga,
night.
Dahlma.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.